Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTube at War. This is an inaugural BookTube event for 2023 that was dreamt up by a viewer, by DDB, who then handed it over to Michael K. Vaughan, who transformed it into a BookTube event, where we read military fiction, military nonfiction, military memoirs, or even military poetry, however you want to do it. Any of the vast, unbelievably innumerable body of literature connected with military matters. And my last couple of experiences with BookTube at War, I've been overdoing it, as I tend to do. Every night when I make my pile of books to read for the night, I put something on there for BookTube at War. And the last couple of times haven't been all that demonstrable. They haven't been all that good. Even rereads haven't been all that good, so I retreated last night into something that not only do I know I enjoy, but also it's one of those books where I don't have any idea how many times I have reread it. And as we've gone over on this channel over the years, that doesn't necessarily mean quality. You don't know what book is going to strike you that way. What book is suddenly going to call on you. It just hits your sweet spots in such a way that you're going to keep going back to it over and over again. Some of the books that I feel that way about have edged themselves onto some kind of canonical list or other, but some of them haven't, and this is one of them. This is the Illearth War by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is book 2 in his first trilogy about Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. It's epic high fantasy. It's extremely indebted to Tolkien. I read it when it was coming out originally, and this is not the same thing as, for instance, typically, although Tolkien didn't intend it this way, typically The Two Towers is seen as the second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Lord of the Rings is not a trilogy, it's a book, one book. But typically The Two Towers is seen as sort of the ur-text for a middle book, and this is not the same as that. It's very indebted to Tolkien, but it's a radically different thing because the first book in this series, Lord Fowl's Bane, not only does it take place years and years, decades prior to the events of this book, but also it feels very different. This feels more at ease in its own skin, more confident, better storytelling. I have often told people who found the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, in a bookstore and maybe wondered, this is a lot to undergo, this is a lot to undertake. I've often told them, if you come over here for Wine and Calzones, I'll bring you up to speed on Lord Fowl's Bane. You don't actually need to read the book. But you don't want to miss the Illearth War. Now, it was easier for me to say that in decades past. As we're well planted in the 21st century, the weird psychological defects of these books, especially the first trilogy, are more and more noticeable. There's no way to avoid the psychosexual elements underneath what's going on in this book, even though I think they probably were a blind spot for the author. There's still no way for the reader to avoid it. I don't believe it ruins the book. Obviously, I keep going back to this thing. I reached for it last night specifically because I was disappointed and wanted a surefire hit. Let me give you a brief thumbnail here. It's not an evening of wine and calzones, but it will still do. This is the story of Thomas Covenant, who is a best-selling author on Earth, in our normal, everyday Earth, driver's license, cars, pavements, TV, whatnot. He's a best-selling author who's approaching middle age, has a wife, he has a kid, and the world looks pretty rosy. And then he contracts leprosy. And if you're thinking that's a metaphor, no, he contracts just ordinary, everyday medical leprosy. And it strikes him out of the blue the same way, if you don't know anything about the series, I'm sure it strikes you as, what? People still get leprosy? I don't even know what that is. How do you get it? How do you treat it? Thomas Covenant doesn't know the answer to any of those questions either, but it totally upends his life. He has to go to a leprosarium. He has to learn how to live as a leper, which means, among other things, constantly surveying his own body. The nerve damage can allow you to injure yourself, can allow cuts or scrapes to go septic without you even noticing. There are medications that he can take to mitigate it, but even so, his wife leaves him, and she takes their kid. And he's ostracized by his community, his town. Once word starts to spread, the pride that they once felt at having a best-selling author in town suddenly turns to the exact opposite. They don't want him around. They don't want him mingling with their people, with their kids. And in the midst of that crisis, Thomas Covenant finds himself transported to a mystical world called the Land. You can think of it pretty much as Tolkien's Middle-earth, with only a few variations. It's wrong to concentrate on the variations if you're coming to this for the first time. In order to make you feel more comfortable with it, you should probably think of the similarities first instead. Just think of this as Middle-earth, and then introduce the variations. But the number one variation in Covenant loses consciousness, and he wakes up in the Land. And he learns that he's been mystically summoned there. But he doesn't believe it. A typical sort of motif that runs through a lot of basically portal fantasies is that the human from our ordinary world spends a long time not believing that it's real. Either that, or they get a catastrophic wake-up call that tells them for sure that it is real early on in the proceedings. Thomas Covenant is dead set on ignoring any wake-up calls that he gets. He doesn't believe that the Land is real, especially because it seems to offer him his heart's desire on two levels. One level is the standard fantasy trope, because he has stubbornly refused to put aside his wedding band, even though his wife has left him, and there's no cure for leprosy, so she's not coming back. He stubbornly refused to stop wearing it, and it's burnished white gold. He wears it on his hand, even though his hand is maimed. Before he got complete control of his leprosy, it cost him 2 fingers. A very, very telling thing that Donaldson is all over this book. Everything in here is intentional, except, like I mentioned, ironically, I think, some of the psychosexual undercoats that I don't believe he was fully aware of. But the fact that Thomas Covenant is a writer and is afflicted by losing 2 fingers, he doesn't lose 2 toes, and that's well thought out on the author's part. Covenant keeps that ring. And in a standard gimmick for epic fantasy, in the Land, white gold is almost unknown and is a talisman of enormous mystical power. Covenant doesn't have any idea how to control it, but the great enemy of the forces of good in the Land, of course the Land is a green sward battlefield for the forces of good and the forces of evil. The main enemy of the forces of good, Lord Fowl, the guy named in the title of the first book, is vulnerable to the wild magic that can be evoked by the white gold, and he covets the ring because of that. This is another epic fantasy revolving around a ring. That's one way in which the Land seems to be offering Covenant his fondest desires, because all of a sudden, even though he doesn't know how to control it, all of the feelings that he's had of being powerless over this illness, over the upheaval that it's caused in his life, over the end of everything, his career, his marriage, all of that feeling of powerlessness is gone, right? Because suddenly he has on his ring finger a talisman of unbelievable power. That's one way in which the Land seems to answer his fondest desires. And the other way is far more immediate, and that is that the Land is such a healthy place, a loving, wonderful, wholesome place, that he starts to regrow his dead nerves. He's constantly telling himself throughout these books that nerves don't regenerate. And yet, the numbness, the coldness that he felt, that he just got used to for his leprosy, gradually starts to go away, agonizing him, driving him mad with the provision of his dreams. Now, gradually he becomes aware of the situation in the Land, which, as I mentioned, the forces of good with a capital G versus the forces of evil with a capital E. The forces of evil aren't actually called evil like in Time Bandits, but close enough. Lord Fowl. He's not called Lord Elmer. He's called Lord Fowl. And opposing him are the Lords of Revelstone, who are basically a convocation of wizards. They, like the wizards of Tolkien's Middle-earth, they channel their magic through staffs. They wear long robes. But they are possessed of a far more a far harder and more dramatic magic system than what you get in Middle-earth. Not that many magic systems could be softer or less dramatic than what you get in Middle-earth. The lords in Revelstone can fire off energy bolts. They can construct elaborate real-world spells, things that will affect the real world, and that will work the same way regardless of who's doing them, and that other people who aren't mystical can see and experience. The lords of Revelstone can do all of that, and they are the defenders of the land, which is a standard Tolkien-esque pre-industrial agrarian world, complete with a map that we get at the beginning. We get a map of the land. So that and unlike in a lot of epic fantasies, the map in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, especially the first 3 books, especially this book, becomes all important. The first time that I read this book, I guess I didn't read them as they were originally coming out. I don't know the hardcover publication history of these books, but I read them as soon as they were coming out in paperback. And when I read the Illearth War for the first time, after about 30 pages, I got sick of just keeping one finger on that map so that I could constantly refer back to it. Instead, I just put a bookmark there so that it would fall right open, because it becomes crucial to understanding what's going on. Because the Lords of Revelstone have been fighting Lord Foul forever, for thousands and thousands of years. And Covenant meets a lot of these lords in Lord Foul's Bane, and he meets them again, some of them, in the Illearth War, but they are much older, because time passes much faster in the land than it does in Covenant's world. So he can go through a long time in the world of the Lords, where what seems to him is only weeks have passed. And he's a weird, odd figure. He's rough and caustic. He doesn't believe that anything is real around him, but he still has to talk to people if they talk to him. And he forms alliances in Lord Foul's Bane that are easily summed up. It's not hard to do. He goes to Revelstone. He meets the Lords. He meets the Bloodguard, a small contingent of strange, curly-haired men from the mountains who swore an oath of loyalty to one of the lords thousands of years ago, Lord Kevin Landwaster. They swore a vow to the land and to Lord Kevin to preserve the Lords of Revelstone and the land against the forces of despite, against Lord Foul. They swore that vow so deeply on the Earth Power, which is the mystical field of energy around the land that's actually healing Thomas Covenant. They swore that vow so deeply that it removed them from age or even sleep. So the Bloodguard don't use weapons. They use their own bodies as weapons. They train and have trained for thousands of years. They are the guardians of the Lords of Revelstone. Covenant meets all of these people in the first book. And he also meets, he hears stories about Lord Foul and his advances on the land. And he hears stories about the enemies of Lord Foul, not only the Lords of Revelstone, but the riders on the plains of Ra, who ride horses called the Ranihin. As I mentioned, this is a heavy homage to Tolkien. And also the giants. There are giants in Middle-earth who live down in sort of the northeast of the land. They live down here, along the seacoast. They have they come from over the ocean, and they have an encampment, a big city on the cliffs of the seacoast. And they are loyal allies of the Lords. All allied against Lord Foul, who is a gigantic energy being, but he has thousands and thousands of real-world servants. Again, an homage to Tolkien. And unlike Sauron, Lord Foul also has an MO. He has a modus operandi that he uses. I guess you could say that Sauron does too. Gandalf is forever saying in Lord of the Rings that Sauron's modus operandi is to sow dissent among his enemies. He opposes them, yes, but he also wants them to oppose each other. For Lord Foul, his motivation, the way that he twists people, is not to suborn them to evil, but rather to suborn them to their own worst desires. He sharpens their own biggest flaws into their downfall, no matter who it is. And he works that way consistently. He works that way with Covenant. But in the Illearth War, circumstances, Covenant returns to Earth at the end of Lord Fowl's reign. He stays there for a while, so that decades pass in the land. But then circumstances at the beginning of the Illearth War propel him back to the land. If you want extra detail about this, on my channel I have done a read-through of the Illearth War. At least once, maybe more than once. So I'm sure you can find those videos, or maybe if I'm feeling industrious, maybe I can find the links to some of those videos. They'll go into far more granular detail. But Covenant comes back to the land. He is summoned back to the land because Lord Fowl is on the rise again. He is threatening war with the land. And Covenant is back in the land. He's meeting these lords again. But his deep down suspicion that he is imagining all of this is still there. Despite everything, it is still there. And despite the basic decency of a lot of the characters that he's meeting, especially Lord Moran, who's much, much younger in Lord Fowl's reign. He's older in the Illearth War, but his staff and his command of the earth power of sorcery slows the weight of years. So he is still a man in hale and healthy age, even though he's, I think, 70 in the Illearth War. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't slow him down at all. Despite the decency of these people, Covenant still sort of thinks that I'm imagining all this. And in the Illearth War, he gets a serious blow to that conviction when he meets another person from our world. Pretty tough to do that. Pretty tough to include such a person if you don't believe, if you're thinking that they're imagining all of this. He meets a man named Hyle Troy, who in the years since he has been absent from the land, has been in the land. He was summoned accidentally. He's not going back to our Earth. In the Illearth, in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, if the person who summons you dies, you go back to where you were summoned from, unless there's a mistake, in which case you stay. And Hyle Troy stays. But he's from our Earth. And he is, I don't think the word is ever used in this book, but he's a mutant. He was born with no eyes. And he wasn't born blind. He was born with no eyes at all. And a compensatory ability to perceive things visually, which absolutely wouldn't happen. But that's the way mutants work, I guess. That ability to perceive dimensions and movements of activities in space and time gradually attaches him to the U.S. military-industrial complex, and he becomes a think tank theorizer, a military wonk, an organizational and strategic brain. And at one point in his career, the building that he's in catches fire, and he's blind, so he doesn't know how to save himself. There isn't anyone else around. Eventually, he ends up in the stereotypical position of hanging from a windowsill, literally trapped between the fire and the fall. And that's when he's summoned. He arrives in the land, burned and blind, but the land works its magic on him as well. It doesn't give him eyes, but it does give him a kind of sight that he's never had before. In fact, in broad sunlight, when his sight is working, it's much greater than the sight of ordinary people in the land. It's telescopic and far greater detail. So he wears dark sunglasses, and still doesn't have any eyeballs, but he can see in the land. And he thinks that Covenant is crazy. What are you talking about? Once Covenant confides in him, he thinks, you're nuts. You're thinking all of this is your imagination? What am I doing here? Am I imagining the same thing? Or are you imagining me? Do you think you're imagining me? The rest of this I can sort of understand. What would possibly give you a reason to imagine me? It's a serious set of questions. But in the time that Hyle Troy has been in the land, he has inexplicably risen to a position of enormous trust among the lords. They promoted him over a lot of other people who were born and raised in the land. They have made him their war mark. They've made him the leader of their military. The lords control earth power, sorcery, but Hyle Troy controls their armies. And he has been working on a strategy to thwart Lord Fowl. He leaves the mystical stuff up to the mystical people. He knows that Lord Fowl is going to field an army. Quite apart from anything mystical that he does, it turns out that Lord Fowl is going to combine the two, because his gigantic army is led by a giant who has been possessed by a mystical object, the Illearth stone. Giants hate Lord Fowl and work against him, But this Illearth stone is a thing of enormous power and allows Lord Fowl to possess a giant who leads an army, is going to lead an army against the land, against the lords. They know this, and Hyle Troy knows this. So he works out a strategy on what to do. And we get a lot of that in this book. I think that's one of the reasons why I find this so enjoyable, is that it's got such a real military tactical edge to it in a way that, I mean, at this time when this was coming out, there weren't that many predecessors to that. Of course, now military fantasy has a huge pedigree now, but when this was coming out, it didn't really have all that much. And to hear it, to hear a mystical war against good versus evil talked about in military and strategic terms is one thing. We get some of that in Lord of the Rings. But to hear it talked about by a military strategist from our world, it's jarring in just enough of a way to make this just a winning thing. I love to go back to it over and over again. So I want to read you a little bit of what I'm talking about. Because an emissary from the Plains of Ra comes to Revelstone to ask what's going on. Why are the lords leaving us out to dry? It looks to us like Lord Fowl is on the move, and the Plains of Ra are between. Let's check them out. The Plains of Ra are between Revelstone up here, where the lords are, and Lord Fowl down here. See, there's where the giants would be. Lord Fowl's down here. If he's going to cross, there's a gap. There's a huge gap in the land. This drop right here. If he's going to cross that drop and march on Revelstone to take the lords, he's going to have to cross the Plains of Ra. And this emissary wants to know, what on earth, what possible good reasons could you have to leave your longtime allies out to dry? And Hyle Troy answers her in very specific strategic terms. He says, I think they were good reasons. He responded. Impelled by an inner need to reassure himself that he had not been wrong, he spoke swiftly. Think about it. You're right. Every time in the past that Fowl has built up an army, the lords have gone to fight him at Landsdrop. And every time they've lost. They've been pushed back. There are too many different ways up from the lower land, and the lords have been too far from their supplies and support. Sure, they put up a good fight, and that takes some of the pressure off the Plains of Ra because Fowl is occupied elsewhere, but the lords lose. Whole Airward get hacked to pieces, and the Warward, which he runs now, has to retreat on the run just to stay alive long enough to regroup and fight the same fight all over again, farther west, closer to Revelstone. And that's not all. This time, Fowl might be building his enemy farther north, in Sarengrave Flat, north of the Defile's course. He's never done that before. But back then, the giants always kept the North Sarengrave clear. This time, he winced at the thought of the giants. They know that something's wrong. They haven't heard from the giants. So they can't count on the giants holding Fowl on their flank. This time it's different. If we marched an army down to you while Fowl was on his way north to Mount Thunder toward Revelstone, we'd be helpless to stop him from attacking the keep. Revelstone might fall. So I made the decision. We wait here. Don't get me wrong, we're not abandoning you. The fact is, I don't think you're in that much danger. Look, suppose Fowl had an army of 50,000, or even 100,000. How long is it going to take him to conquer the Plains of Ra? He will not, the emissary says, through gritted teeth. The Warmark nodded. That's who Hyle Troy is. He's their Warmark. And even if he does, it'll take him years. You're too good at hunting. He can't beat you on your own ground. You and the Rannihin will run circles around his troops, and every time they turn their backs, you'll throttle a few more score of them. Even if he outnumbers you 50 to 1, you'll just send the Rannihin into the mountains and keep chipping away at him for God knows how long. He'll need years to do it, even assuming we're not attacking his rear. No, until he's got the lords beaten, he can't afford to tackle you. That's why I've been thinking all along that he would come north. See, that is Hyle Troy thinking things out strategically. Now, even the emissary has to admit that does make a kind of sense. You're gambling with a lot. The riders of the plainsmen of the Plains of Ra revere the horses of the Rannihin and don't like them being put in danger. But there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that plan. But it goes to pieces. As the age-old military historian adage goes that your plan does not survive first exposure with the enemy. It comes to Hyle Troy's attention. It comes to him a little later in the book that plan won't work because Fowl is on the move early. He's mustering his forces faster than Hyle Troy thought, and he revises his plan on the fly. He says, I'm not going to waste time apologizing for this mess I've gotten us into. I built my strategy on the idea that we would get word of where Fowl was marching in 15 days. Now we're 5 days short. That's all there is to it. Most of you know generally what I had in mind. As far as I can learn, the old lords had two problems fighting Fowl: the simple attrition of doing battle all the way from Landsdrop and the terrain. The center plains favor whichever army is fresher and larger. My idea was to let Fowl get halfway here on his own and meet him at the west end of the Mythil Valley where the Mythil River forms the south border of Andalane. Then we would retreat southwest, luring Fowl after us across to Doom's Retreat. In all the legends, that's the place where armies run when they're routed. But in fact, it's a hell of a place to take on armies that are bigger and faster than you are. The terrain, that bottleneck between the mountains, gives a tremendous advantage to the the side that gets there first, if it gets there in time to dig in before the enemy arrives. Well, it was a nice idea, but we're in a different war now. We're 5 days short. Fowl will be through the Mythil Valley 10 days from now, and he'll turn north, forcing us to fight him wherever he wants in the center plains. If we have to retreat at all, we'll end up in Trothgard. He paused for a moment, half expecting groans of dismay, but most of the people simply watched him closely, and several of the lords had confidence in their eyes. Their trust touched him. He had to swallow down a sudden lump in his throat before he could continue. There's one way we can still do it. It's going to be hell, but it's just about possible. Then for an instant he faltered. Hell was a mild word for what his warriors would have to endure. How could he ask them to do it when he was to blame for the miscalculation which had made it necessary? But Elena, that's the High Lord of the Council and baggage of problems on her own, was watching him steadily. From the beginning, she had supported his desire to command the war, and now he was Warmark. He, Hyle Troy. In a tone of anger at the extremity at which he was asking, he said, "Here it is. First, we have 9 days. I absolutely guarantee that Fowl will hit the western end of the Mythil Valley by the end of the 9th day from now. That's one of the things not having any eyes is good for. I can measure things like this." It wouldn't be true, but that's okay. All right, 9 days. We've got to get there before that and block the valley. Morin, you and 200 Bloodguard have got to leave tonight. Calandril, that's one of the lords, you go with them. On Ranihin, you can get there in 7 days. You've got to stop Fowl right there. He asks a lower grade magician, an artisan, how many rafts they have, and he tells them how many rafts they have, and that will shorten the trip. All right, we have 12 horse-mounted Eoward, 240 Eomen. Borilar, I need 120 of those rafts. Quan, you're in command of this. You've got to get all 12 mounted Eoward and Vermin down the Mythil Valley as fast as possible to help Calandril and the Bloodguard keep Fowl from coming through. You've got to buy us the time we need. Second, the rest of the ward will march straight south from here to Doom's Retreat. That's something less than 300 leagues. I think you should explain this to your commands. We've got to get to Doom's Retreat in 28 days. And that's only enough if the Hiltmark can do everything that I have in mind for him. Tell your Eoward, 10 leagues a day. That's going to be the easy part of this war. In the back of his mind, he was thinking, 10 leagues a day for 28 days. Good God, half of them will be dead before we reach the southern plains. And he continues on with those plans, and that is what he puts in motion. But he's miscalculated again. And later on in the book, he gets a chance to be told that. He is waiting on a promontory called Kevin's Peak, which is the tallest point in the land. He's waiting for the sun to rise, because when the sun is up, his enhanced vision will allow him to literally look at Fowl's army, even though it's an enormous distance away. But while he's waiting up there, one of those Bloodguard comes back with news. And it's devastating news. There are 2 Bloodguard told stories in this book. They're both devastating news for the good guys. And they alter things. the size of a Fowl's army alters things. Once Hyle Troy actually can see how big Fowl's army are, he's heard the reports, but once he can see it, then he knows that something radically is different, that even his new plan won't work. He tells the assembled people here, we're going to leave here. Fleshhauer, that's the possessed giant, and his army probably won't arrive before midday tomorrow. By that time, we'll be long gone. The halves, those are his next in commands, gaped and blinked momentarily as they realized that he was ordering another march. People are devastated. They're walking corpses from the 28 days that they had to do. Then several of them groaned aloud, and others recoiled as if he had struck them. Even Quan, that's his weathered second in command, winced openly. Troy wanted to rush into explanations, but he contained himself until one of the lords stepped forward and protested, Warmark, why will your former plan not suffice? The warriors have given their utmost to gain Doom's retreat, as you commanded. Why must we leave? Because Fowl's army is too goddamn big. He did not want to shout, but for a while he could not stop himself. We've killed 10,000 Kresh and a couple of thousand Erviles. Those are servants in Lord Fowl's army. But the rest of that army is still out there. It's not 3 times bigger than we are, or even 5 times bigger. Fleshhauer has 20,000 times our number. 20. I've seen them. With an effort, he caught hold of his pointless fury, jerked it down. My old plan was a good one while it lasted, he went on, but it just didn't take into account how big Fowl's army is. Now there's only 2 things that can happen. If that giant sends his army in here just 10 or 20,000 at a time, the flight is going to last for weeks. But we've only got food for 6 days. We'll starve to death in here. And if he cuts through in one big blast, he'll get control of both ends of the retreat. Then we'll be trapped and he can pick us off in his own good time. Now listen to me, he shouted again. I'm not going to let us get slaughtered as long as there's anything I can do to stop it. Anything at all. If there's one thing, just one, I've got one more trick to play in this game, and I'm going to play it if I have to carry every one of you on my back. And they agree. They've been following his advice for a long time. They agree. And they ask him, where are we going to march? And he says, I'm not going to tell you. Because you won't do it. If I tell you what the full extent of my new plan, you won't believe it. You won't do it. You'll think I'm crazy. And when later on in the book he does reveal the full extent of that plan, they do think he's crazy. They want to know, are you possessed? Are you raving? Are you mad? Because he is leading them to their doom. And counting on Lord Moram, the character that I mentioned, he's counting on Lord Moram to save them in a way that even Lord Moram has no idea how he will do. Hyle Troy certainly doesn't. It's a leap. It's an absolute leap. In other words, wonderfully, classically, Lord Fowl has made Hyle Troy do exactly the kind of thing Lord Fowl always does. He doesn't suborn your will. His servants might try to do that. In this book, there's a scene where the giant tries to suborn the will of a lord directly, just override their mind. But usually what Lord Fowl himself wants to do is let your own weaknesses bring you down. It happens with High Lord Elena in this book. It happens with Thomas Covenant over and over again. And it happens with Hyle Troy. That march to a place of utter destruction, to what looks like certain doom, right ahead of a gigantic army that is ripping you apart. You're no longer moving faster than it is. It's tearing apart your rear guard. You've got that behind you, and it's completely unbeatable, and you're rushing to the one place that Hyle Troy can think of, and it might be deadly too. In other words, at the end of this book, Lord Fowl has made Hyle Troy choose between the fire and the fall. He's brought Hyle Troy right back to where he found him, dangling from that window ledge. It's wonderfully, wonderfully done. I won't say anything about the psychological or psychosexual elements that underpin a lot of the first trilogy of Thomas Covenant. We don't have to dwell on any of that right now. All I want to say is that this, as a reread, really put me back on my feet for BookTube and more, because it's terrific. I haven't even read you the brutal parts, where the armies meet and fight. It's just incredible. And there's the lords get involved as well, including one lord whose heart is broken. His wife is dead. He's always felt himself inadequate against her strength. And when he learns of her death, it's just too much for him. And those final scenes are incredibly bittersweet. In this book, we also learn the fate of the giants down on the shore, and it's horrifying, absolutely horrifying. Again, I'll try to remember to leave all my videos about this book. I don't know how many I've made, but I figured since BookTube at War was kind of disappointing me, I would go back to put it mildly, a known quantity. So that's what I did for last night. I don't know if I'll do that again this night. I might have the bravery in me now to try something new, but otherwise I will give another field report tomorrow, and I'll let you know then. Thank you, BookTube.